The Franco-Flemish War was a conflict between the Kingdom of France and the County of Flanders between 1297 and 1305. Causes: Philip IV of France became king in 1285, and was determined to strengthen the French monarchy at any cost. The County of Flanders had been formally part of the French kingdom since the Treaty of Verdun in 843, but had always de facto been largely, if not fully, independent from the French crown. Flanders had some of the richest cities of the time, like Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, Lille and Way. These cities tried to keep their independence from the Count of Flanders and from the rural aristocracy, but the cities were themselves divided between the rich patricians and the urban tradesmen, united in guilds. In 1288, Philip IV of France used complaints over taxes to tighten his control over Flanders. Tension built between Guy of Dampierre, Count of Flanders, and the king. In 1294, Guy turned for help to King Edward I of England, arranging a marriage between his daughter Philippa and Edward, Prince of Wales. However, Philip imprisoned Guy and two of his sons, forced him to call off the marriage, and imprisoned Philippa in Paris until her death in 1306. Guy was summoned before the king again in 1296, and the principal cities of Flanders were taken under royal protection, until Guy paid an indemnity and surrendered his territories, to hold them at the grace of the king. After these indignities, in 1297 Guy attempted to revenge himself on Philip by an alliance with Edward I of England, now at war with France. Philip responded by declaring Flanders annexed to the royal domain and sending a French army under Robert II of Artois to conquer Flanders. 1297 to 1300. First phase of the war. In January 1297, Count Guy formally broke his allegiance to King Philip IV and allied himself with King Edward I of England, Count John of Holland, Count Henry III of Bar, and the King of the Germans Adolf of Nassau. The Count of Flanders, however, would receive little support from his allies. An invasion of Champagne by the Count of Bar was easily beaten back. The German king encountered opposition from a French-backed rival, Albert I of Habsburg, and fell in battle in 1298. And King Edward encountered opposition by the English nobility against a Flemish enterprise and was faced with the First War of Scottish Independence. This meant that Count Guy effectively faced the French alone. The Count's eldest son Robert of Bethune speedily occupied Mortaigne, at the confluence of the Scheldt and the Scarpe, and the castle of Helcaine. In March 1297, King Philip IV arrested all partisans of Count Guy and seized all the property. Philip IV then occupied the castle of La Recluse near Douai. In June 1297, Philip IV gathered an army of about 3,000 knights at Compiègne. The French army marched on Addis, Lens, and reached the Franco-Flemish border near Douai on 14 June 1297. The next day, part of the French cavalry, led by the king's brother Charles of Valois and by Raoul de Nesle, crossed the border near Raches and encountered part of the Flemish army, consisting of German hired troops, which was beaten back. After this setback, Auquis surrendered to France. Valois' troops raided and burned the countryside up to Lille, but then returned to the French main army. On 16 June 1297, the entire French army entered Flanders, marching upon Lille and burning the towns of Seclin and Luz on the way. On 17 June, the city of Lille was invested and a formal siege, lasting 10 weeks, began. During the siege, French raiding parties marched through the Flemish countryside, burning or conquering the towns of Coman, Waston and Kortrijk. which surrendered to Valois. In August 1297 the French troops were reinforced when Robert of Artois returned from his successful campaign against Edward in Aquitaine. Artois' troops marched upon Castle, which, except for the Flemish-occupied castle, was burned, and to Sint-Winoxbergen, which surrendered. By August 20, Artois' troops had reached Vennes. The Flemish counterattack on Artois ended in a French victory at the Battle of Furnes. 5 days later Lille surrendered to King Philip, and the Flemish army, led by Robert of Bethune and 3,000 men strong, was allowed to march out to Rousselara, although facing problems at home. At the end of August 1297 King Edward eventually moved an army of 895 knights and 7,560 infantry and bowmen to Flanders. Finding no support in Bruges, the king moved to Ghent and made that city his base of operations in Flanders. After the fall of Lille, the French main army marched upon Kortrijk and Ingelmunster. On the 18th of September 1297 Philip was met with a delegation from Bruges which surrendered the city to him. The city was occupied by French troops led by Raoul de Nesle and Guy IV, Count of St. Pol, but its port Damas was retaken by troops led by Robert of Bethune. Papal mediation led to an armistice, starting in October 1297 and at times prolonged until 1300. During this period negotiations between the French and English kings and the other warring parties, including Count Guy, took place at the papal court, while simultaneously strengthening the defences of the Flemish towns in the hands. Having reached an agreement with his barons to fight the Scottish threat, in March 1298 Edward and his forces left Flanders, effectively abandoning his Flemish allies. King Edward's expedition to help Flanders was aborted and he made peace with Philip in 1298 and left Guy to his fate. Second phase of the war, French conquest. By the end of 1299 Count Guy had turned over the government to his eldest son Robert. After the expiration of the armistice in January 1300, the French invaded Flanders again, starting skirmishes alongside the armistice line of 1298. A French detachment led by Wale-Payel plundered and burned the countryside around Ypres and Castle, and Charles of Valois marched from Bruges to the outskirts of Ghent, burning Nevele and 12 other towns and hamlets. From March 1300 the French besieged Damas and Ypres, where the defences respectively was led by the Count's sons William of Dendermonde and Guy of Namur. At the end of April William surrendered Damas, Aardenburg and Sluis. Ghent surrendered to the French on the 8th of May, Oudenarde on the 11th of May and Ypres on the 21st of May 1300. By mid-May the old Count, his sons Robert and William and several Flemish nobles were led into captivity in France, and the whole of Flanders was under French control. French occupation and local insurrection. The conquest of Flanders had been relatively easy, because the Flemish cities had remained neutral up to then. The patricians had a long history of conflict with the Count of Flanders over the level of control the Count had over the affairs of the cities. The patricians had turned to the French king for support, who had thankfully intervened in the favor, thus increasing his influence in Flanders. The Flemish supporters of the French king were called Leliards, and also included a part of the rural aristocracy. The urban proletariat hoped for more justice and a better distribution of wealth under the new ruler, but Philip IV appointed Jacques de Chatillon as governor of the county, a very bad choice. Together with the Leliards, this undiplomatic soldier imposed a very repressive government, raising new taxes, which infuriated the Flemish. Soon the urban guilds forged an alliance with the Flemish nobles supporting the Count.
They were called Liebarts Klauwards. On the 19th of May 1302, a rebellion broke out in Bruges where the Flemish populace killed every Frenchman they could find, including the French garrison. This event was called the Bruges Matins. De Chatillon escaped with his life. Now the rebellion became general. William of Jülich, the grandson of Count Guy, arrived in Bruges, and became the leader of the Flemish uprising. He was supported by his uncles John I, Marquis of Namur, and Guy of Namur. Soon, most of Flanders was under the control. Only Cassel and Kortrijk remained in French hands and the city of Ghent remained neutral. When the Flemish besieged Kortrijk on July 9 and 10, a powerful French army led by Count Robert II of Artois arrived to crush the rebellion. The two forces clashed on July 11 in an open field near the city in a battle that became known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. The French cavalry charge was stopped by the tactically sound position of the Flemish militia and the muddy terrain, and many French knights were slaughtered. This battle returned full independence to Flanders for the next 2 years. Two attempts by the French king to take revenge for this embarrassing defeat were averted by a Flemish army under William of Jülich. The second time in the bloody Battle of Arques, 1304–1305. In the meantime, Flanders was again at war with the Count of Holland. John II, Count of Holland since 1299, also ruled over the county of Hainaut and the county of Zeeland, and was part of the House of Avonay, the hereditary enemy of the Flemish House of Dampierre. Zeeland had been contested between the Count of Flanders and the Count of Holland since the early 11th century and had become part of Holland by 1076. The Flemish invaded Hainaut in 1302 and conquered Lessines. Guy of Namur, son of the Count of Flanders, formed a fleet at Sluis and sailed on the 23rd of April 1303 to claim Zeeland for the Flemish. After some initial successes, Guy was defeated on 10 and the 11th of August 1304 in the Battle of Sewerage by a combined Franco-Hollandic fleet under Rainier Grimaldi, who had been sent by Philip IV of France to aid the Count of Holland. Guy of Namur was captured and Zeeland remained firmly in the hands of the Count of Holland. 1 week after this naval battle, on the 18th of August, Philip IV himself fought the Flemish main army at the Battle of Mons and Pevel. This hard-fought battle was inconclusive, but the death of William of Jülich and the serious material losses of the Flemish made them sue for peace. After further minor battles, eventually the Treaty of Addis Sewerage was signed on the 23rd of June 1305, which recognized Flemish independence, but at the cost of the cities of Lille, Douai and Orchies, which were transferred to France, and the paying of exorbitant fines to King Philip IV.